Gee, they just about broken.
It's kind of used a lot. It's been banged a lot.
Just like to inform members that on Thursday at our Festival of Trees, we managed to raise that night $660,000 for the hospital, and after that over $1 million for the hospital in our local areas. So, and I got to be the MC, so was I ever lucky? Anyway, yes. Anyway, I'd like to welcome our guests, and the format, I think most of you know what it is. Basically, we'd ask you to keep your comments to about 10 minutes and or less if possible, and then the members will have questions. The first round will be 10 minutes, the second round will be 5 minutes, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can in the 2-hour time frame. So if we could begin with the Salt Institute and Richard Hanneman, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's an honor to be with you, and I would remind you that we've not only submitted extensive written testimony back in June, but we had 2 earlier opportunities to provide oral testimony. So we will confine our remarks today to enforcement, public participation, and appropriate tools, which we understand to be particularly your concern today. And in most of our remarks, we'll deal with public participation. Generally speaking, we've had a very positive experience with the SEPA public participation process as it regards the implementation, the risk management phase, and a relatively negative experience with public participation with regard to the risk assessment process. Unlike the risk management phase, where stakeholder involvement invaluably improved the end product and facilitated implementation, the insularity of the assessment process and the agency's refusal to impose rigor in its scientific exercise it impaired the result and set back the implementation, and was a distinct misstep. We were quite disturbed, for example, when Environment Canada came to publicize its findings before they went to the public participation process, and they scheduled a news conference. We were unable to, at the last second, be able to effectively respond and rebut some of the misinformation that was given out. And the headlines across the country were all about the warnings that road salts were toxic, and this being a food, of course, was very unclear and confusing to the public, and Environment Canada, we think, played on that as opposed to trying to understand that that's what was going to happen. So the assessors proceeded to ignore that public outcry and go to the second phase, and at that point they understood that they were in trouble with their communications with the public. So when they announced the second phase, they did not use the word toxic. They very studiously avoided it. They even, I think, counseled the media that they intended not to use it, and yet the headlines were salt is toxic, and again, the press had been sold this, so they couldn't back off. About this time, Environment Canada was trying to tell the world that road salts were toxic, but at the same time they were rolling out the implementation process. And so, unlike the rather obscure public participation process of the Gazette process for the assessment, the implementation for the risk management phase was very public, very inclusive. A stakeholders group was set up, and there were a lot of constructive things said. So instead of having the situation that under the assessment it was the largest public participation process under SEPA. I believe that's still the case. Most of the comments came back negative to what Environment Canada had proposed, and instead of being able to condition the group that was going to have to comply, which is the provincial and the local government agencies that were the target of the assessment, it set us back in terms of mobilizing those people in a constructive way to solve the problem. It bears mention that the risk management phase was an entirely new team. The people who did the assessment were in one branch, and the people who did the risk management were in another branch. There was no carryover, and so it was a whole new set of people getting up to speed. And so we're very pleased to report that in contrast with the public participation in the risk assessment phase, our experience with public participation in the risk management process and in implementing a very excellent code of practice for road salts management has been very positive. It was like night and day to us. And we'd give Environment Canada, frankly, failing grades for public participation in the assessment process, but tell them to go to the head of the class in terms of the way they ran the risk management phase. And as is the case with most environmental initiatives, once people understand how to do things better and once they make necessary investments to achieve better environmental management, there's momentum that's achieved by these incentives. And in the case of road salts, the agencies now understand that proper management not only can protect the environment, but can be accomplished consistent.
Mind slowing down just a little bit? Our interpreters are having a little bit of trouble keeping up with you.
All right.
Thank you.
My 2-hour statement's in 10 minutes. But what can I say?
Thank you.
In the case of road salts, the agencies understand that proper management not only conveys environmental benefits and can be done consistent with accomplishing the mission of keeping the roads safe, but can also even save tax dollars by being able to put down road salts a little more conscientiously. So designing a solution that allows society to derive the benefits of SEPA managed materials is fundamental. We can't compromise the safety of the roads. We can't trade dead motorists for pine trees. We can't sacrifice workers' jobs for a park ranger's opinion that salt intoxicates birds. And we can't immunize governments against civil suits if they don't do their job of keeping the roads safe. So, bottom line is, we think that the involvement of the stakeholders has achieved a momentum for enforcement of or implementation of the code of practice, which is getting the job done, which would not have been expected given the tenor of the assessment process. So turning then in my remaining time to the issues of enforcement, why would we have enforcement? What we want really is the environmental result. So we want people to be encouraged, induced to adopt the correct practices. Now, the Salt Institute has been engaged in teaching our customers sensible salting for about 40 years. And we have sent out people to train the operators, because it's the operator in the cab that actually decides how much salt's going to go down. It's not the road agency itself, and certainly isn't the salt company that months before sold them the salt. So we really need to get training down to the operator level, and that's what we've been doing in partnership with TAC and with the OGRA. And we have, I think, been quite successful because we've been able to work cooperatively during the risk management phase with Environment Canada. So in terms of what we want to do, we don't really want to regulate something that is going to be so variable, because the weather, the topography, the service demands, and the service demands are set by locally elected officials. Those are all going to vary storm by storm, not only region by region. And so we need to give enough flexibility so that a regulation that is written can be applied in a real-life situation, which is a life-and-death situation on the highways in the middle of a winter storm. So we do think that promoting compliance is going to be best done with a voluntary arrangement such as a code of practice. So that moves into the final point of appropriate tools. Right now we have a code of practice, of course. Also, we have tools of pollution prevention plans where there's a regulatory arrangement. And we are engaged with Environment Canada in negotiating an environmental performance agreement for the salt industry to do its part in terms of producing the product and storing the product properly. But we don't see any need to move into a regulatory environment if you can get the voluntary situation to work, because in our case anyway, there's a great deal of local variability in terms of what proper management is. We believe that the statutory process should encourage Environment Canada to promote risk management much sooner and focus resources earlier on doing a better job with environmental management. Where regulations may be required, the focus of the debate should be on the context of the substance that's creating the problem in the first place, as opposed to the name of the substance, which creates the stigma that we've testified about earlier. And once again, with this approach, we believe we'll achieve a better environmental outcome. And we thank you for your attention.
Good. Thank you very much. Ms. Wright, you might want to comment at the end on a couple of the statements that were made there, and we'll give you first crack at that at the end. If we could go on to the chemical producers and Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the committee. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this round table. In my presentation, I'm going to be focusing on one topic, the question of tools for SEPA, and I'll really only be talking about one tool, industry responsibility programs, which is something that I think isn't used as much as it deserves to be used. Last May, when I appeared before you and I discussed our SEPA review submission, and we suggested that SEPA should explore differentiating between good and poor environmental performers more than it does, and using the Act to support the use of what we called industry responsibility programs to recognize and encourage good-performing companies. We think those companies should be treated differently and more favorably than poor performers. Guidelines, and in particular, I think pollution prevention planning requirements in the legislation could provide a means to do just that, but that isn't being done nearly as much as it should be today. There may be other means as well, but those are the ones we'd like to focus on. So criteria for using what we're going to call industry responsibility programs and principles governing their design have already been well established with broad acceptance by industry and ENGOs. And the New Directions Group in the late 90s put together a paper, Criteria and Principles for the Use of Voluntary and Non-Regulatory Initiatives to Achieve Environmental Performance Objectives, that addressed and I think very successfully resolved a lot of these issues. There's very broad consensus about going ahead on this approach between industry and government, environmental groups, and in fact the federal government essentially adopted the New Direction Group principles in its Environmental Performance Agreement policy framework that it put out in 2000. Now, in CCPA's view, that was a very good framework, but unfortunately we don't feel that it's being applied as broadly or often enough as it deserves to be. There's been a number of successful examples of industry responsibility programs. From a chemical industry perspective, our Responsible Care Initiative that I've previously described, I think, quite a bit to committee members, we believe is a leading example. Now, it applies to the chemical industry and not broadly, but other sectors also have similar programs that they try to, I think, model after it. Now, our Responsible Care program is also being the underpinnings of a Memorandum of Understanding or agreement that CCPA has had for about 10 years that involves the federal government, British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, and also public interest group representatives on it as well. The performance results of responsible care and what we look at through our Memorandum of Understanding are set out in the attachment that I've provided to the committee and I think has been given to you. And I'm not going to go through this in any kind of detail. I'll leave that to you. The first chart is an overview of our performance, both for the listed air pollutants in Bill C-30 and greenhouse gases, and I'm sure looking at the percent changes, both since we started tracking in 1992 and more recently last year, you'll agree our performance is good. And similarly, I've talked about our climate change performance before this committee before, and I think it's also good. And there's more detail provided in the accompanying charts that back up those figures, and it also shows that generally our record is that we exceed our projections. Now, as I said, industry responsibility programs have also been used beyond the chemical industry. Probably the best broad example of a successful program is ARET, the Accelerated Reduction and Elimination of Toxics Initiative, that concluded in the late 1990s. And more recently, Ontario and Alberta have tried to develop programs along these lines. Ontario Environmental Leaders Program, and in Alberta, their EnviroVista program. Problems with these types of programs to date have arisen when, in an effort to ensure that only the true leaders participate, sometimes overly restrictive and burdensome bureaucratic entry criteria are imposed by government. And that makes it unattractive for companies to participate and would actually penalize and certainly not reward high-performing companies. it might be worth paying some of this extra price if there was real true benefits from these programs, but often there's only very vague recognition rather than any real benefits, such as a better permitting procedure or something like that. Ontario and Alberta are currently struggling, trying to address these issues in their respective programs and trying to create meaningful differentiation and real rewards for high-performing companies. I think the federal government had the lead in this about 5 or 6 years ago, but I think is being overtaken by the provinces now. Encouraging industry responsibility programs through SEPA would, I think, also be very consistent with the 2004 Smart Regulation Report. The report stated the federal government should develop a framework to guide the design and the use of instruments and ensure that instrument decisions are appropriately challenged throughout the policy development cycle. The government should accelerate efforts to make the regulatory community more aware of the various instruments. Legislative constraints on creating mixes of policy instruments and using performance-based regulations should be eliminated. And I think we have an example of a legislative constraint in SEPA that I'll talk about later. The Smart Regulation Report described the challenge the federal government faces in being innovative in the use of instruments related to regulation. They noted the many benefits of choosing the most efficient instrument to accomplish legislative objectives, and they also noted the federal government has a strong tendency to choose only traditional instruments such as regulation, as opposed to a combination of instruments which would involve regulation but also other approaches like economic incentives, information, challenge programs, the type of things we're referring to as industry responsibility programs. One of the more interesting recommendations in the Smart Regulation Report were recommendations 22 and 23, and these outline the need for the federal government to develop guidance and a framework on the use of various instruments and when they might be most effective, and the need to develop better understanding in the public service of the range of instruments that are available to respond to policy issues. Now, over the years, we've had many discussions in CCPA about our success in responsible care. And the question often emerges, well, why doesn't government do more to recognize this type of good initiative? And I think that's a question that MPs and this committee should address in your SEPA review report. We would be very interested in the answer. One of the things that CCPA believes is a reason that government doesn't recognize programs like responsible care and our record is they often agencies like to simplify the world into what we would see as a false dichotomy of so-called voluntary versus regulatory programs. Then they dismiss anything that is not a standard regulatory approach because it is only voluntary. Do it if you like. Well, responsible care is far from that. It's a program that goes beyond what is required. Our actions under responsible care are mandatory among our members. They involve reporting and verification, including independent verifiers. We think responsible care is the kind of initiative that can be considered in developing regulatory frameworks and linked to SEPA in various ways, such as pollution prevention planning. Now, since the Smart Regulations report, has anything changed? We don't think so. We've seen no improvement in the administration of SEPA towards the kind of innovation the report recommended. The Clean Air Act and the Notice of Intent are probably the most recent examples. These do not look for innovative approach beyond traditional regulation and miss opportunities to use different tools that might be more effective. They did not provide in any way for recognizing high performers. The government is proceeding to work with sectors like ours as if responsible care were irrelevant. And this type of approach undermines the ability of our association to expand the application of responsible care to other companies. And this is an example of the government missing an opportunity to reinforce high performers. With SEPA under review, it would be useful, I think, to determine if the Act has built in appropriate first guidance and second flexibility for the government to work with the full range of instruments, including industry responsibility programs. In terms of guidance, we think the Act could be improved here, and we would urge the committee to recommend that the government consider adding some specific clauses to the Act that promote considering the use of industry responsibility programs, but with an overall regulatory context of SEPA. In terms of flexibility in the legislation, we think that is actually there, but it's not being used. Pollution prevention planning is a tool in SEPA that it seems to us could be used more and more effectively to support and promote industry responsibility programs. Environmental objectives could be set for our sector as factors to be considered in developing pollution prevention plans. What companies are already doing, such as under responsible care and our MOU and under provincial regimes, could be recognized under the pollution prevention plans. We believe that for sectors like ours, this would work very well. If the approach failed to work, or for sectors that don't have the kind of infrastructure and performance record that responsible care has given ours, perhaps regulatory approaches would also be warranted where necessary. But the government has not used its pollution prevention powers in the fashion that I've described. We're not sure if the powers in the Act are the problem. We don't think so. We think they're there to be used as I've described, or if it's a question of political will. And I think that's where the real problem lies, and I think that's also what the Smart Regulation report was reporting to. To conclude, CCPA urges that the committee recommend the CEPA be used to differentiate between good and poor environmental performers and use the Act to support the use of industry responsibility programs such as responsible care to recognize and encourage good performing companies. This approach would assist industry to be partners with the government when companies show leadership and high performance. From CCPA's perspective, our member companies, with their commitment to responsible care and their performance record, provide an example of the type of companies where such recognition would have been earned. Such an example would also encourage more companies and sectors to adopt initiatives similar to responsible care, and we think that would be a significant environmental improvement in itself. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Good. Thank you very much. We'll go on to the Sierra Legal Defense and Mr. Wright.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to address you this afternoon on these issues of public participation and enforcement. I will be dealing with two matters that no one else, as far as I know, has dealt with in these hearings. The first is the Environmental Protection Action, which is found in Part 2 of the Act, and the second is the Offences and Penalties section, and in particular, I'll be recommending a provision like the Fisheries Act, fine-splitting provision. Now, our interest at Sierra is that we're considered a watchdog, if you will, on the environment. We only deal with legal matters. We have offices here, rather in Toronto and in Vancouver and soon to be in Ottawa. So we look at the legal aspects to these environmental issues. My background is 20 years of commercial litigation in private practice in Toronto, so I've seen both sides of the fence. The last 6 years I've spent in public interest litigation. There's been a lot of talk, as there should be, about voluntary programs. Mr. Lloyd talked about them. We think those are great, but we also think you have to balance it. You have to balance that with enforcement. Now, I submitted a written brief, which I understand some or most of you have, and in that I highlighted these two issues of public participation. In the public participation section of the Act, it really deals with 5 things. It has an environmental registry, an application for investigation. It has the environmental protection provision. That's the action I've been talking about. You can also bring an injunction if harm is going to occur. And lastly, it refers to the civil action in Section 20. So it talks about harm before it occurs with the injunction. It talks about it after it occurs with the environmental protection action or with the civil action for damages. As far as the environmental protection action goes, it's modeled after the Ontario provision in the Ontario Bill of Rights. It has a reasonableness standard, and one has to show significant harm. Limitation period of 2 years, and the onus is the balance of probabilities as opposed to the criminal onus. So one would hope or think that this would have been used in the past. It has not. It has been used only once or twice. It has not met the need of the public to participate through this environmental protection action. I mentioned the other possibilities, one of which outside of the Act is a private prosecution. Another is acting under other statutes such as the Fisheries Act. It's very clear this environmental protection action is not working. Why is it not working? There's, I suggest, a couple of reasons, but frankly, I don't have the answer. I think that requires more study. However, I would note even the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario has commented on this provision and the fact that it has not been used. And in fact, the Ontario provision has not been used often either. Part of the reason is the cost, the potential of costs that can be put on a person using the Environmental Protection Action. There's no environmental protection action if the defendant engages in any kind of mitigation. There's no emergency provision in the Environmental Protection Action. I'd like to read out just the government's own conclusions on the Environmental Protection Action and the public participation, and that's contained in something that is at document at tab A of our materials called the Formative Evaluation of CEPA 1999. And in that, at paragraph 2.2, the expected outcome of this action was that Canadians would have the opportunity to initiate investigations of alleged offences, recover personal damage and economic loss, make personal claims, and file citizen suits. Well, it hasn't happened. As they note, the public participation provisions have not yet been triggered, as no relevant public applications for investigation or public environmental protection actions have been received. One environmental protection action was initiated under Section 22 request, but this was dismissed by the Minister. Under their issues and challenges, the government itself, commenting again that very few public applications for investigations have been made, talks about the barriers to increase public participation and their not having been formally examined. Again, I said I don't have all the answers. I think I would have some of the answers because we engage in activities under the Fisheries Act, i.e. Private prosecutions. We've never done it under CEPA, and if we haven't done it, it's unlikely that anyone else will do it because we're one of the few organizations in the country who do this sort of thing. And to conclude, this is reading from the government document again. The expected outcome related to Canadians initiating investigations of alleged offences, recovery of personal damages and economic losses, making personal claims, and filing citizen suits is unlikely to be achieved without further actions by the Department. Work needs to be done to identify and address barriers before the opportunity provided through the public action provisions of the Act can be fully realized. We make a few suggestions in our document. We laid it out by showing the CEPA provision. We laid out suggested amendments, and we had a comment column as to why that was necessary. There are provisions in numerous U.S. statutes that provide for citizen actions, and we feel we can do a better job. We've also included a section on enforcement. And we suggest there should be a Fisheries Act-like provision. The Fisheries Act is the main pollution prevention provision that we use, the federal one in any event. It is not CEPA. CEPA is anemic as far as individuals beginning and constituting actions for harm to the environment. One of the advantages of the Fisheries Act is that it has a fine-splitting provision. It's been around a long time. It has not opened the floodgates to these kind of private prosecutions. It is very useful. It takes some of the sting out of the bringing a private prosecution under the Fisheries Act because you can recover half the fine if you initiate a private prosecution. So our main recommendation on that regard is there's nothing comparable at the moment in CEPA, but as I said, in the other main pollution prevention statute, the Fisheries Act, we have one. So why not have one in CEPA? And I throw that challenge out to you. To conclude, I think you have an opportunity here to really give valid and real public participation as was intended by the Act. Pretty well every poll out there shows the environment is near the top or at the top of concerns of Canadians. You've got an opportunity here to bring laggards into line. Mr. Lloyd, was talking about good performers, high performers. They're doing the job and others not. This would be a good club to bring them into line. And I think any socially responsible corporation would concur with the suggestions made under both our headings of public participation with the Protection Action and the Fisheries Act fine splitting provision. And finally, this is an opportunity to put SEPA on level with the Fisheries Act. Why not? Why shouldn't we protect our citizens as well as we protect our fish? Thank you very much.
I will go on to Great Lakes United. Mr. Stack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for having me once again testify. The Canadian public's interest in environmental stewardship polls relatively high on voter priority lists, but it's rarely reflected by way of broad participation in SEPA consultation. Committed environmental groups such as Great Lakes United will continue to consult under various provisions of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. But I think we'll nonetheless be left wondering what to do in terms of engaging the public at large. Two backgrounders were prepared by Great Lakes United under the auspices of the SEPA Review Advisory Committee, and I've tabled those to the clerk for your review. For the purposes of analysis, GLUE's following comments are loosely grouped as access and outreach, the mechanics of consultation, and the absence of departmental champions. On public access and outreach, comprehensive state of the environment reporting, I think, would be very beneficial for attracting public interest in SEPA. To date, as it stands now, it's the National Pollutant Release Inventory, more commonly known as the NPRI. That's the primary tool through which the public engages or gets information on pollution data for Canada. Progress on the NPRI has largely stalled since 2002, and as of August 2006, I believe, PCBs, thallium, beryllium, barium, radionuclides were still not included on the inventory, despite years of having been tabled for discussion. Likewise, recommendations to reduce reporting thresholds have gone unheeded. Revisions to mining exemptions have not been addressed, and the credibility of NPRI data is undermined by a lack of auditing polluter reports. Other SEPA databases should be tightened to report on actual pollution levels rather than volume of pollution permitted. I'm referring there to ocean dumping requirements. The use of other statutes and pollution reporting mechanisms, for example greenhouse gases, that fall outside of SEPA further undermine efforts to draw public attention to SEPA as a one-stop shop for pollution information. State of the environment reporting has been poor and insufficient for promoting the Act and government efforts at pollution control generally. State of the environment reporting needs to be enhanced and should include reporting on specific SEPA provisions, including efforts to meet international agreements impacted by the Act. I'm referring there to international emissions to air, land, and water. With no public profile for the Act, a lack of ministerial reporting, and precious few cuts to pollution to report, the value of the SEPA registry is challenged not by the website architecture, but rather by what I would describe as ministerial disinterest in reporting on progress and insufficient interest in promotion of public participation. For those reasons, a concerted promotional campaign for highlighting SEPA as Canada's cornerstone pollution statute and for the release of the State of the Environment report would be both beneficial and I think actually might be needed. Under the heading of mechanics for consultation, Environment Canada has a well-established history of public consultation and supported in part by the delegate selection processes of the Canadian Environmental Network, whose members nominate ENGO representatives on various issues. Environment Canada does a much better job than most federal departments, including notably Health Canada, at ensuring stakeholder balance at consultation and at avoiding undue influence in the selection of ENGO representatives. That said, treatment of First Nation representatives has been inconsistent under SEPA. At times, they fall under the rubric of civil society and effectively displace an environmental representative on that point. And my point here is that First Nation delegates typically will focus interests on issues of governance, representation, treaty rights, rather than on broad issues of civic interest and operationalization of the Act. So it's therefore unfair to dilute representation of non-governmental organizations with representation from Canada's First Nations, and it's equally unfair to characterize First Nations as stakeholders on par with environmental groups and private industry. In so much as they represent governments or ambitions of self-governance, most First Nations must be consulted outside of SEPA's delicate balance, stakeholder balance between industry and the NGO sector. The third point I want to address is the lack of a departmental champion for the environment. Stakeholder balance alone is insufficient to guarantee credible outputs from consultation. Exactly how and the extent to which participants engage largely determines final recommendations coming out of consultation. Whereas departmental participation is necessary and encouraged, it is not at the moment balanced in so much as no department champions the environment per se. By way of example, consultation at Consultation Natural Resources Canada is routinely able to identify with recommendations that reflect mining and forestry interests. Health Canada ensures its pharmaceutical clients are not undermined by proposed action, but Environment Canada seems steadfastly focused on consultation process rather than on promotion of environmental protection. Rarely at consultation does Environment Canada table its recommendations for discussion or provide critiques to consultants' reports. More routinely, as recently reported to GLUE from CCME meetings, is the stakeholder review of discussion documents prepared by third-party consulting firms without the benefit of critique or indication of what the department plans to do with the report. The public is more frequently consulted on consultants' reports than on any proposed policy direction intended to realize SEPA objectives. Environment Canada needs to step beyond the current role of coordinating input toward one that also shows leadership in environmental protection in a way that identifies the recommendations the department is tabling. At consultation, stakeholders should be reacting to draft recommendations, not to the recommendations of private consulting firms. In the view of Great Lakes United, dedication to State of the Environment reporting, an enhanced NPRI, improved stakeholder balance, and a special track for consulting with First Nations, along with departmental leadership in championing environmental protection, will all improve the Act's capacity to engage the public. I'm sorry that timelines didn't allow for specific clause-by-clause proposals for text. I'll be submitting those later this month.
Clerk.
We will do that. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Ms. Wright, did you want to comment on the assessment failure mentioned earlier?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've said this before publicly, so I think it's fair to say it in front of this committee. We learned a lot through the road salts example, Mr. Chair, and I think we learned a lot about how difficult it is for the public to understand the word toxic and how much upfront work you need to do to indicate what the intention of adding a substance to the schedule is. And I was pleased that the witnesses did indicate that the risk management has gone better, and that's what we've been trying to more do, give a sense when we add something to the schedule, where are we trying to go, what are we trying to do in terms of managing the risks. That being said, though, I just don't want the committee to feel that there's no engagement and consultation during the risk assessment phase. There is expert peer review. There are discussions with experts, and there's a peer review process. And then the purpose of publishing a Canada Gazette notice about the intent to add a substance to the schedule is to ensure that there's formal engagement. But that being said, I think we learned a lot about the process that we went through with road salts.
Good. Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Silva.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank also the witnesses for coming forward. We have heard from many of the organizations before, so it's another opportunity to hear them again. I just want to be clear for the record, and maybe I misheard incorrectly, but there seems to be one particular view, and there seems to be another one by the department. I want to make sure we clarify that. And there's particular, we all know that enforcement actions are essential to ensure that the compliance with the Act. But education promotion activities encourage the compliance with the Act's essential parts. And Mr. I think it's Hannenman, you stated that you're sort of given failing grades for the participation. And I didn't hear anything from the department, from Mrs. Wright, commenting on that. And I just wanted you maybe to clarify, and maybe I can hear from Mrs. Wright to hear what she feels, in fact, whether there's adequate participation or not, whether it's working or not as well.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond on that. We believe that the public participation in the assessment process although there was a peer review and although there was a formal Gazette comment period, that there were several deficiencies. We've testified to that before, but the primary ones that we would say is in the peer review, for example, the peer reviewers were not even listened to by the department staff. We had the point that during the Gazette process, one of the peer reviewers, who was an expert and consultant and an author of some of the background documents, actually had to write in protest that the department staff had misrepresented his views in the report that they filed. I'm not sure that I understand.
Let me just take one. I think we have to differentiate between the Gazette consultation process and a more open one that might occur with, for example, on the risk management process for road salts, which is a very robust process involving hundreds of stakeholders across Canada. The Gazette process, which is what you get when you're involved in a risk assessment, as you know, is simply publication in a magazine called the Canada Gazette. Unless there's an attempt to have people participate in that process, it really can be very obscure. And to be fair, certainly in the first phase of the risk assessment, it was only because the salt industry stimulated conversations on it and actually went out and told the municipalities and the provinces that there was this process for them to participate in. Had we not done that, there would have been very little participation in the whole issue of whether road salt should be listed on Schedule 1 or not. And that could be improved, I have no doubt. I mean, Dick also mentioned I mean, at that time, for some reason, I'm still baffled by it, at least in August 2000, Environment Canada felt that they had to hold a national press conference on the issue, and we were given 1 day's notice about it. And I don't frankly think that was public participation either. I mean, it did get some news coverage, obviously, on road salts as toxic. But just to summarize, I think the Gazette process is a little obscure, and if you do want to enhance public consultation in the risk assessment, I'd suggest that maybe Environment Canada could make that more robust.
And Mrs. Wright, when you answer the question, maybe you can also state how we can avoid this situation, maybe.
The reason I said I think we've learned a lot is I think initially the kinds of substances we were dealing with were obscure substances. I think in the past, SEPA 1988 was dealing with substances that were difficult to pronounce, unknown, and the purpose of the risk assessment phase was to really gather the science and the evidence of whether or not these substances were being properly managed, prevented from entering into the environment in such a manner that it caused human harm to the environment or danger to human health. Why I say road salts was learning, because road salts was one of the early substances that we tackled that was dealing with something that people knew and understood. Mm-hmm. And intuitively had their own judgment of how it causes harm or not. And so that means that there needs to be more care for communicating what the science tells us about it and then where we're going in terms of managing the risks. And I think that's the part that we've learned and tried to do better as we've dealt with some other substances that are more of a common nature.
Just wanted to also clarify something. When I was in City Council in Toronto, the issue of salt, of course, was raised many times, and I tried my best to either to phase it out or to limit as much as we could salt, because there's other alternatives to salt that can be used for our roads, and it's not helping our environment, it wasn't helping our water, and it's damaging our environment. Yet, even with the classification of salt as a toxic, it didn't seem to at all diminish the usage of salt in our city, and I guess in our most of our municipalities. I'm wondering what is it that we can do to make sure that in fact, by us putting maybe stronger legislation, we can in fact see if we can phase it out or reduce it within our municipalities.
I think that the reports that Environment Canada has received as part of the code implementation, they receive annual reports, have shown actually just the opposite. including both in Toronto and throughout Canada, but very strongly throughout Ontario, which has been wildly enthusiastic about cooperating. And I think the record shows that although we've been preaching use the minimum amount of salt necessary to keep the roads safe and commerce moving in the winter for 40 years, that it wasn't until Environment Canada really came in and created this stakeholders process and brought everyone to the table and explained to them that people listened. So I think you cannot rely on the industry, even though we have tried very hard to be the public education. But I think the record will show that the usage of salt by Ontario municipalities in the last 3 years is dramatically reduced.
Yeah. Well, you don't mention the fact it's also we had warmer weathers in the city of Toronto and other cities as well as to the reason why we're using less salt. But I don't want to get into another debate because I think my honourable colleague also has another question. And I'll go in the second round to ask more questions.
You have 3 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask a question, if I could, of Mr. Lloyd. Thank you very much for attending, lady and gentlemen, this afternoon. Mr. Lloyd, I want to kind of, if I can, cut right to the chase because we've worked together in the past on different issues. And I want to go to your brief where you talk about, in conclusion, you say that SEPA ought to be used to differentiate between good and poor environmental performers, and that this Act should be used to support the use of industry responsibility programs to recognize and encourage good-performing companies. The reader is left hanging and the viewer is left hanging with a question just how it is we should do this. In fact, our government worked hard with you and so many other stakeholder groups for years to, for example, devise eco-efficiency indicators, which would allow for meaningful comparison between not only companies in your responsible care program, but for companies, for example, that hail from other sectors, like pulp and paper, for example. So I want to put to you, number one, if you could you help us understand, for example, could eco-efficiency indicators be used, and ought they to be reflected in the Act? And secondly, ecological fiscal reform is, most Western democracies now realize, the way forward. We need to find the way in which we're going to have a meaningful intersection of fiscal policy and environmental policy. Can you tell us, for example, how that might be used to achieve your objective, which is to have government recognize and reward good performers over bad performers?
Sure. Let me tackle the second question first. And I've made this point, as has our CCPA President Richard Payton to this committee before. I think it's really unfortunate that improving capital cost allowance isn't being looked at from an environmental dimension. We've talked here before the committee, and I think Jay Myers from Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters made the same point, that it's pretty well demonstrated that if you get more new investment, you're going to have, with those newer plants, better environmental performance. One of the things that governments can do to attract more of that new investment to Canada would be improving the capital cost allowance provision. So I think that's the type of example that would fit into your second question of the type of economic instruments that the government should be using. So we think that should have been part of, for example, the notice of intent and the package of measures around greenhouse gases. I think it also applies to air pollutants, but it's not. The first question means to differentiate between poor and bad performers. I kind of allude to that a bit in the couple paragraphs before my conclusion. I think there are tools in SEPA that could do that. Pollution prevention planning tools could be used for that. But the problem is that they're not being used. And I think that's a question of political will. And I think that's also what the Smart Regulations report said. Now, I don't know what the Act can do to encourage that political will. One of the things that we're suggesting this committee do is to suggest, say, there be preambular text to ensure that governments at least consider that type of approach when they look at instruments that they're going to use. I think that would be helpful. Now, it wouldn't be determinative. I haven't answered your specific question about indicators. They might fit into that, but I think the idea that I've put forward about pollution prevention planning would be an easier way to approach this within the existing framework of the legislation and the kind of tools that we already have but aren't using enough.
Good, thank you. Mr. McGrath.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions mainly concern the document that was submitted to us by the Sierra Legal Defense Fund. Appendix 1. I think that is the most informative document we have on changes to CEPA since 1999 and on CEPA's development. I think that it was a good idea to put off the review of the CEPO, given that this document says that we had to wait until 2004-2005 before having the first enforceable orders, the first CEPA enforceable orders. Mr. Chairman, that means that if we had reviewed this act after 5 years after it came into effect, there probably wouldn't have been any enforceable orders to date. So what I want to know is why was it necessary to wait for 5 years before there were any enforceable orders under CEPA? And I'm talking about 2004, 2005. There were 100 orders at the time, and those are the only orders actually that I can see in the report.
Compliance orders, and the reason they were used extensively in the last couple of years is with regards to dry cleaning regulations. This is a tool just to make sure everyone is on the same page that is allowing, essentially, it's like a stop work order. So there has to have been evidence of a violation to use this tool. It's a fairly new tool. It came in with CEPA 1999, so in the early days there had to be training and awareness both of our staff and in the industry around it. And it has been used fairly significantly since the training has been done and the awareness, and it was used extensively in the dry cleaning regulations.
I understand, but there were over 25,000 inspections that took place over that period. So why were there 100 orders? That's still my question. How do you explain that there were so few orders over 5 years when we need to make sure that this act is enforced? Second, out of those orders, how many occurred in Quebec? Second, who issued those orders? Were they federal officers? Because if I'm not mistaken, under the Act, the environmental officer can come from another jurisdiction, so there could have been another officer involved, a provincial officer. So those are my questions. How do you break down those compliance orders and how many occurred in Quebec?
We've used in enforcement earlier. We can certainly make sure that's brought to the attention of the member. I just want to make sure there's an understanding that the Environmental Protection Compliance Order is not the only enforcement tool. It's the tool to use if there's not a change in industry's behavior right away. Often when industry has violated a law, they're aware of it, and they're often taking action as we're inspecting. So there's often a willingness to comply right away. Environmental Protection Compliance Order is a tool where there has been lack of evidence of a willingness to comply. We could get the statistics on Quebec. I don't have those in my hands, but I think we did give just total summary, so we can look at that. And then who, yes, the law does allow training and designation of other members, but I believe that most of those, if not all of them, have been by Environment Canada staff, but I can look into that as well.
Redistributed just prior to this meeting, Mr. McGrath.
But I'm not I think
maybe not the details.
Level.
Yes, yes.
Okay, deuxième question.
My second question is this. How do you explain that over 5 years there were only 33 convictions. Does that mean that the alternative measures are working? Or does it mean that the Act doesn't have to be given more teeth than it has? Does that mean that everything is fine? And that there have not been any violations or offences that have actually gone all the way to a conviction? Because 33 isn't a particularly high number over 5 years. When investigations are conducted, if no offence is found, then no action is taken. So that's usually an indication that there is compliance with the Act. So, for example, in the pulp and paper industry, there's a 99.8% compliance with the Act. So that truly is an indication of the fact that the industry is complying with the Act. What does Mr. Wright think of that? Does that mean that the number of 33 means that we have good corporate citizens in the end?
In fact, the number for CEPA 99 is at our tab H, and the number for CEPA 99 was only 24. So 9 of those 33 were for CEPA carryovers for CEPA 88, according to the records we were given. In our view, that's inordinately low for what is supposedly at least said to be Canada's premier environmental protection piece of legislation. There's been more activity, certainly, I believe, under the Fisheries Act. It doesn't mean that everything should be resolved by way of prosecution, but it is there and available, and it surprises us. I think the suggestion by the government itself in that document I referred to earlier, the formative evaluation, and we keep that at, or have that at Exhibit G or Tab G. The government's own conclusion was that, and I quote, "It is not possible to determine whether expected outcomes with respect to Part 10 being the enforcement section, of the Act will be achieved as measurement and reporting systems capable of documenting progress towards expected outcomes in this area remain under development at the time of this evaluation." This evaluation was in March of 2005. Such systems will need to be developed and implemented in order to ascertain the likelihood of progress relating to the expected outcomes. So in our paper, we also ask for an increase in the information obtained and analyzed to assess whether the enforcement is working. In our view, in our own experience, that is not indicative of enforcement with that number of convictions. However, we would concur with this paper, the government paper, that they need to look at it very seriously and analyze it properly. I hope that answers your question.
Mr. Lucier, do you want to finish? You have about just less than 2 minutes.
Oui, ma question est pour Monsieur Lloyd.
Yes, my question is for Mr. Lloyd. In your brief, you mentioned that you have memorandums of understanding with 4 provinces. What about the other provinces?
We don't have sufficient operations in the other provinces to warrant doing that. We actually have a what I would call a national MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. It's with the federal government is a signature, and at the ministerial level from 3 departments, industry, health, and environment. In its first renewal, Ontario and Alberta also joined. And in its upcoming renewal, which is still in progress, British Columbia has joined, and Quebec is participating in the management group for this. It's called the Environmental Protection Steering Group. And Quebec isn't signing the same document as everybody else, but we're developing a parallel MOU with them. And they see themselves and came to the last meeting and participated as a full participant. And then we also have environmental groups that participate in this. Several of them, we have a national advisory panel for responsible care, which have people from various walks of life. So we have a couple of representatives from there, and then some environmental representatives as well. So it's not like with each separate provincial government, it's kind of all in together, although we will be having the separate arrangement with Quebec so they can participate in our national approach. And we also have we have a separate agreement also with Ontario related to that. And that's basically the answer to your question. So
Thank you, Mr. Lucier. I just would mention that Mr. Cullen did come to see me, and he is at Ms. Broadbent's memorial this afternoon, just so you know where Mr. Cullen and members of the NDP party are. We'll go to Mr. Warwa, please.
Mr. Vellacott.
Oh, Mr. Vellacott.
Thanks. I guess the question I want to be asking, probably to each of the witnesses, I think would be a good thing to have you respond each one if you could, to the issue of whether you think SEPA places too much emphasis on voluntary instruments such as guidelines, codes of practice and policy statements, or is something more required? Is it just too much emphasis on those voluntary things? Do we need something else?
Thank you. I would say that our remarks will have to be confined to our issue, which is road salts. Yeah. And in that, I think that the appropriate response is a voluntary code of practice as has been worked out. I don't think that a regulation can be sufficiently flexible to reflect the operating conditions and the local topography and environmental conditions to make it work. I could envision that other substances might very well require an enforcement regulatory approach, but we're talking about a situation where we have millions of tons of a very low threat material, and so it's really the question of where it gets concentrated, and does that concentration occur at a place where it is vulnerable to that kind of a challenge.
Okay. I've said this before, I'll say it again, and I think that if the discussion with industry in particular about substances, because it's a substance-based act, focus more on the use of the context of the substance and the problem areas that resulted from the use of those substances, the human use, that you'd get to solutions a lot faster. And frequently, regulations would be the best solution, and everybody might agree to that. I think one of the problems with the statute is the broad nature of the process by looking at a substance broadly and all its uses. It just makes for a real mess if you want to get agreement quickly. So if we looked at context, use, human dimension of a substance, I think you'd probably get to regulation faster if that's your objective.
And do I understand you to say then that you are in support of moving to some greater regulatory approach?
No, I'm just saying, I mean, in some cases all stakeholders might agree. I mean, I see where there's agreement that in order for equity and fairness to work, I think if you looked in context, you'd get a lot more agreement. No, I mean, some things obviously wouldn't work in a regulatory environment. Some things do. It just depends on the circumstance. And I think even Environment Canada or Health Canada would agree that, you know, every situation is different. Every solution is different for every situation.
Okay. Gordon?
Well, first of all, I think we should stop using the word voluntary because it has the wrong connotation. It has the connotation that these are things you do if you want to do. And where you're going to have these kind of programs and you're going to rely on industry to do it in a non-regulatory sense, I think there should be some ability to count on industry to be able to deliver. There should be an infrastructure with the sector, reporting, and it's not voluntary in the sense of do it or not do it. It's up to you. The legislature is going to take a route of having industry use a non-regulatory approach with the assurance that it will get done. So that's why I call these things industry responsibility programs instead of voluntary programs. It's a nuance perhaps in language, but I really wish 10 years ago when we started to talk about these, we picked a different word. I think we kind of trapped ourselves collectively into the wrong lexicon on this. And I think industry responsibility programs need to be more embedded in the Act, in trying to make sure that they actually do deliver on what's committed. That's why I suggested one approach might be tying them to pollution prevention planning, which gives a quasi-regulatory use of a quasi-regulatory instrument. The government can set out factors to be considered, things that it would like done, and the industry can respond through its industry responsibility program of how it's doing that. Like I said, I think that's allowed for in the Act. The problem is there seems to be not much political will to use it, and I think that's partly because this false dichotomy we've set up of voluntary, which has the notion in the public of, well, they can do it if they want, versus regulatory, where I think there's really this very important ground in between, where you're not using a regulation, which tends to be complex and much more difficult, I think, to achieve results, but you are using the fact that it will happen, it will get delivered, and you're tracking against that. So I hope that helps.
Well, partly. I guess I'm still a little confused. Some of us might be around the term of regulatory as opposed to quasi-regulatory, and I don't know it's either regulatory or it's not. But I'm still not, really clear in terms of subtle distinctions here. You either regulate or you don't. But I'm a little baffled on that, I guess I'd say. So.
Well, I think there's actually something that's in the middle where it's quasi-regulatory in the sense that it's reflected in the legislation, like pollution prevention planning is, but it leaves, I think one of the bases of pollution prevention planning is there's a recognition that if government, through stakeholder consultation or whatever, sets out some broad objectives to be achieved and then leaves industry to achieve them with some kind of commitments that they will be achieved, industry is going to be able to achieve the objectives in a more efficient way than if it's done through regulation, because regulation tends to always be very prescriptive. We talk about performance-based regulations as an ideal, but I don't think we often get that. So I think with an instrument like pollution prevention planning, you can have something that does have the benefits of being enshrined in the legislation, which I think improves public confidence, allows objectives to be set out, but has greater flexibility in terms of how it can be implemented.
Okay, Nathan,
you wanted in on this?
Okay. I just wanted to offer a quick comment. I hope clarifying, when you talk about industry, that's not the situation that we're facing. We have 5 salt producers in Canada. That's all. It's easy to enforce against them. That's not what we're talking. We're talking about thousands of agencies and tens of thousands of operators who are actually putting the salt into the environment. And that's where the, quote, enforcement has to be done. And that's where you have thousands, and those occur in different storms with different approaches.
Yeah.
You comment.
To help clarify the process and the tools, the department does have a guidance manual it follows every time it's making a decision to control risks of a substance or prevent risks, and it does consider the full range of tools, from regulations to call it voluntary or call it industry-led tools. And it does look at factors like the compliance rate of the industry currently, the nature and severity of the risk, the probability of compliance, a number of different factors, which is often related to the number of facilities, the dispersiveness of them. And so we'd be happy to share that tool so you can see the way we approach our work.
That'd be good to have that. I wouldn't mind to see that. I don't know, through the chair, if Robert Wright or Derek Stack had responses to that, and maybe also responding to Mr. Lloyd and Mr. Hanneman.
Sure, I would like to. We would favor more of a regulatory approach. We think that brings certainty. It levels the playing field. One of the goals of enforcement in all of the policy manuals of Environment Canada are that enforcement is carried out in a fair, consistent, and predictable manner. And we believe the regulatory approach will do that. one I'm most familiar with is, of course, Fisheries Act. We have the pulp and paper effluent regulations. We have a complaint before the CEC on those now. But at least those regulations are there. You can go in, you can see whether they're being enforced. There's something measurable that helps the enforcement people. They're not dealing with some airy-fairy ideas about what's voluntary and what is not. So I think that it is useful, and I think we have gone perhaps a little far the other direction. Of course, on the ground, one of the problems is often those responsible for enforcement see the people they're enforcing against as their clients, so they end up getting a little closer than they would otherwise, and so the tendency is to move to voluntary programs. Again, we've made two suggestions which we think will help bring the laggards up to speed and level the playing field for the good performers.
Well, I would echo what Mr. Wright has just said, and also I think the question was, are we relying too much on voluntary versus regulatory approach? Well, maybe if we spent 5 years focused on regulatory, we could compare a little bit, but as it stands, I think it's a tough comparison to make.
Thank you, Mr. Vellacott. We'll go on to Mr. Scarpellegia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a very interesting discussion, but it's hard to really get a handle on it because, for example, in terms of I think it was Mr. Lloyd or someone else said, well, we need to look at context. If we're going to take action on certain chemicals, we need to look at context. Yet, then other witnesses talk to us about risk management, and it seems to me that risk management is all about a study of context. So it's very hard to understand that context isn't taken into account. That's one question. I don't know. Anyone can take a stab at that one. The second issue that is still unclear to me is the issue of the salt regulations or management program, voluntary management program. Mr. Hannan, you seem to suggest that you were okay with SEPA the way it is, but that the government's actions were not as appropriate or effective as they could have been. So does that mean you are okay with the fact that salt is considered SEPA toxic? And Ms. Wright, you started with some mea culpas, or it seemed to be anyway at the beginning, but you weren't specific. What went wrong there? First of all, are you fine with Mr. Hannan with the idea that salt is SEPA toxic? And what really went wrong? If you could name one or two specific things that didn't go well in this case, I'd like to know what they are.
If I may start to respond, we are not comfortable with the designation of road salts as SEPA toxic. And that's why we have argued that they should not be added to Schedule 1, where they would be SEPA toxic. At this point, Environment Canada has made a designation which is sort of, in the way the process works, sort of a recommendation to Cabinet or whoever is going to make that decision. And so therefore, we are not stuck with the SEPA toxic label at this point, which would dramatically impede the cooperation that thousands of government agencies have been willingly given. And I think it would be unnecessary, since you have every indication that that without that designation, people have been most responsive to environmental improvements.
Mr. Chair, if I could just clarify, the Salt Institute was actually here back in September.
Where you talked about how the SEPA toxic label was impeding or almost shut the Japanese market, the door to the Japanese market.
Well, that was certainly one of the points made, but we also presented some recommendations for changing the statute. So we weren't. I think you made the comment that we were happy with the statute the way it was. Our interests really in that presentation were to try to make the statute more workable to try to get to positive actions for the environment faster. So,
but I guess I'm a little unclear.
Just so you know, we do make some significant recommendations to change the statute, and we have.
No, I understand, but like for example, we spent a whole session talking about how the SEPA toxic label had hurt salt.
The discussion, as I testified earlier, the discussion put out as a news nationwide press conference saying salt is toxic, and the headlines parroted back, salt is poison. Okay. That's what hurt, and that's what poisoned, if you will, the working relationship and set us back several years.
Sure, but then the government reacted to that in some way by not labeling salt as SEPA toxic.
Once the cat's out of the bag, that was the problem.
No, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there seems to be enough flexibility in the legislation that if something is a product, a commonly used product like salt, road salts, that the department can somehow nuance its position and take that into account. The problem is maybe that they didn't do that right away, and they should have. But it seems to me that, as I was saying at the beginning of my intervention, the context does, the law does allow context to be taken into account, and B, it really was at the end of the day in the case of road salt. So, I don't understand the problem.
It was taken into account. In other words, the recommendation was that road salts, all sodium chloride, all potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, was going to be called toxic. That's not localizing it. Obviously, all salt of any of those salts are not toxic.
No, but in the end, it was not considered SEPA.
Correct, but it was the discussion that caused the problem.
No, I understand that, and that's where the department probably erred. But it seems to me that the framework of the legislation is adequate.
Well, time is up. Sure. You can pick up on that. And you can maybe pick up on that. And Ms. Wright, I know you went in there as well. Mr. Calkins.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just, the testimony is pretty good. I think everybody's kind of pointing in the same direction with the windsock maybe teetering a little bit left and right, depending on the particular issue. I know that the salt guys have a specific issue here that they want to talk about, and the chemical producers as well. Everybody's got their interests at heart, and I certainly do appreciate some of the difficulties that this legislation poses. But where I want to go with this is, like how often are these things being used? I guess for the department, like how many complaints do we get? How many voluntary submissions do we get? As far as people bringing forward information of wrongdoing and so on, is there adequate whistleblower protection on this for some of these submissions?
Well, there is whistleblower protection, and we think it's fairly modern and powerful whistleblower protection. If your question is how often do we get people using whistleblowing, so making a complaint, informing us, it's not often. I think two things, though, our observation is the regulations under SEPA are, as I said earlier, substances that are somewhat obscure. They're not usually as visible as the kind of substances or the kind of regimes under the Fisheries Act. So they're a little bit more difficult for citizens to understand, and therefore more costly to understand what the violation is, etc. So those are the reasons that we're coming up, that citizens don't use these tools more often. But the Act has fairly modern tools for allowing citizens to make the environmental protection action, criminal or civil law proceedings, whistleblower protection. It has a number of these tools in it.
Okay. I have a question for Mr. Wright. In this discussion was talking about, obviously you want to make changes parallel to the Fisheries Act as far as the penalties are concerned. I've got some concerns with that because when you're talking about the Fisheries Act, you're talking about water. Nobody owns the water. So when you're talking about penalties and so on, I mean, it's obviously we're just dealing with fish. But when you're talking about environmental protection, I mean, we're talking about whole different levels of property ownership that could be involved. And when you start talking about these penalties, where half goes to the person laying the charge, we're talking about a whole different amounts of money and a whole different context compared to the Fisheries Act, and I have some serious reservations with that. I was wondering if you would like to address that first, and if anybody else on the panel here would like to give their input on that as well, because I don't think it's an equal or fair comparison, frankly.
Okay, thank you. I respectfully have to disagree with that. We own the water. The water is a public resource. The fisheries are a public resource. In the Fisheries Act, there's a case right now in PEI as to whether the fishery resource is held in trust for the people of Canada. So we'll wait and see what the court has to say about that. So I'd have to disagree with your starting point. And I don't think the difference, even if there was a difference that you suggest, I don't think it really holds up under analysis. Here we are dealing with toxic substances. We're dealing with substances that are known to be toxic to human beings. How can you have a lesser regime dealing with substances that are toxic to human beings than the one dealing with fish? We're left in the conundrum of using the Fisheries Act as our premier pollution prevention legislation. It's pitiful. I mean, it's ridiculous. If anyone stood back in any other country and you looked at this, in the U.S. they've got a Clean Water Act, a Clean Air Act, what have you. We have the Fisheries Act, and it is our strongest provision. It is the only act that has the provision I'm suggesting. It's a federal act. It's got a long history of being used respectfully and used responsibly. I suggest we should go for it with SEPA. Bring it up to par. I hope that dealt with the issues. If you have any further questions, be pleased to answer.
Mr. Teeter wants to talk, I think, about part of it, but I want to specifically address the point that was made that that SEPA deals with human health. And it does, but it doesn't have to. In the case of road salt, it specifically was not alleged that salt was toxic to human health. And that was part of the public confusion, is that under SEPA, it is something that could be called toxic to human health, but no one was alleging that. Health Canada has reviewed salt in the diet for many, many years and is quite confident, I'm sure, that salt is not toxic to human health in the amounts used. Anything's toxic in what dosage.
Yeah, I'm sure that Cynthia or Gordon would know this better than I do, but I think that it's you're completely right. I mean, the complexity of the interactions with society is much greater with SEPA than it is with the Fisheries Act. In my opinion, and I think it's true. Not the least of which is the constitutionality issue, which is a reality that no one disputes the fact that the federal government has constitutional authority over fish and water, and it's much more complex in the case of SEPA managed substances or SEPA assessed substances, as we found out in the case of road salt. So I don't think these two statutes are actually easy to compare when you look at them very carefully. Would you not agree, Gordon? Yeah. Cynthia? Yeah.
Gra. Thank you, Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to better understand the enforcement of the Act, sometimes it's good to take an example. So I'd like to take the case of tetrachloral hexylene. It's used in dry cleaning. And I was surprised to see that in Quebec probably has the most dry cleaning per capita in Canada. The substance that I named, and correct me if I'm wrong, was assessed under Section 64 of the Act, and it was found to be toxic. Regulations were established under Section 73 of the Act, and there was a round table set up with industry, environmental groups, and government. A training group was established in 1998, specifically near Quebec City, with a view to encouraging codes of practice. And today, we don't know where we stand with respect to the enforcement of the Act. What is happening? Are there inspections? Have any actions been taken under CEPA? So sometimes it's good to take a case and then to see how the Act has been enforced in that specific case.
We did give the numbers of investigations, inspections, compliance actions in the summary documents, and we can certainly give them for Quebec. And we can give, relative to that particular substance that you're talking about, the regulations, the level of inspections in Quebec. In our annual report, we do break it down by jurisdiction, so we can give you more detailed information. But it's fair to say in some cases, for instance, the Quebec government did get out in front of the regulation and did provide a trading incentive to encourage industry to get into compliance with some of these issues and around the dry cleaning early on. So I don't know for sure if that is one of the reasons why we have less actions in Quebec, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is. But it's an example where two levels of government were trying to achieve the same ends and use both their authorities on how to do that.
Mais comment va, parce que ce que je comprends, c'est...
From what I understand, new machines were encouraged, the installation of more effective machines. And what they tried to do was encourage the use of a code of practice, for example, in terms of collecting residues. So I'd like to know what happened with these codes of practice, because what happened was they encouraged some sort of effective management. Was that management due to codes of practice? Because I went onto your internet site and I saw that there are about 10 to 15 dry cleaners in Quebec involved, perhaps 15 to 20, who have been certified out of 700. So there's a lot of work still to be done. Is it due to these codes of practice? Is that what led to those results? Well, I don't have the specific information on those codes, but we could ask the clerk to get that information to you. But we did do some follow-up. For example, in terms of road salt, there is a code of practice. And so we can add regulations as well. If a code of practice doesn't give the desired outcome, then we can establish regulations. So we have followed this up. So what you're saying is there haven't been any convictions? Well, not to date, no. Thank you.
30 seconds. One question.
Well, I'd like to come back to the question of codes of practice and the road salt machines. Have any reports been established under these codes of practice? For example, the number of people who have been trained out of the 25,000. Are there any annual reports that have been drafted?
Produced 2 years of annual reports, and we've been briefed on them at stakeholders meetings. I don't have the figures in front of me, but they're very impressive in terms of the percentage. I think it's somewhere around 90% of the municipalities, counties, provincial governments who are participating in the program.
Saying you have 2 years of annual reports? Has there been a decrease in the use of salt, and if so, what percentage are we talking about?
Not going to be a relevant statistic, but I do believe that there has been a diminution of salt. Do you have the numbers, Cynthia?
I don't have the numbers.
I think you can say that the amount of salt has gone down. I don't think you can conclude from that alone that that is progress. It depends, as was said earlier, about weather. I mean, there was a conference here in Ottawa last spring where they talked about the effects of global warming and what would that do to winter maintenance activities. The conclusion was it would mean more salt would have to be used.
Est-ce que c'est votre intention?
Next round, Mr. Warwa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I again appreciate the witnesses for being here today. My riding is Langley, British Columbia, We don't use a lot of salt in that area until this weekend. I'd like to continue on the vein of enforcement and compliance, and basically how issues are initiated of compliance and enforcement, and how we work with industry to make sure that they're aware of the statutes. So that would be my first question, I believe, for the staff, for the department. How do we make sure industry is aware of their obligations? And then is it a step-by-step, who initiates that there is a problem from a specific company or a use of a substance that is it a public complaint? Is field officers? Who initiates that? And then is the educational progressive as they deal with that person that is not using the substance properly? There's a compliance issue. Are they educated through the process? And there's only fines if they are pushing back and not wanting to be a good citizen. So just basically, how do we go through the education and enforcement?
Okay. In the early days before regulation is passed, we begin what we call compliance promotion with industry. So we do workshops, training with them to explain what their obligations are, how they're going to have to measure or report or whatever's relevant. So there's extensive training, workshops, written material, etc. With dry cleaning, it was translated into numerous languages, mails out, as well as sessions. We often work through industry associations to reach the regulatee. So everything we can to get out to the regulatee before the regulation comes into effect. Then who initiates the action? Once a regulation is in effect, we have an inspection plan. That inspection plan is based on our knowledge of the degree of compliance we think is already in place when the regulation comes into effect. Because usually it's pretty close, compliance level when the regulation comes into effect. We have a history on companies. We generally have some fairly good information on who has a tendency to comply. And based on that, we'll do an inspection plan across the country, looking at where we expect violators. So our enforcement officers will go in, conduct inspections, and then based on that information, they can go into a number of different enforcement tools. So usually in first level, particularly if the industry is showing a high degree of willingness to comply, we have what's called a warning letter. That's letting it out very clear what the expectation is, and then we follow up on that. If after following up on the warning letter there is still some violations, and if they're not serious of nature, we have another step we can use. We can use an inspector's directive, which is really, as it sounds, spelling out exactly what we expect to have done by when. Then we can go into a number of actual enforcement tools that can lead to penalties. There is that environmental compliance order that we were talking about earlier, which allows us to ensure that there's a stoppage of whatever the violation is. We have a range. If there's a charge laid and an industry showing a high degree of willingness to comply, there's something called the Environmental Protection Alternative Measure, which is essentially like a dispute resolution to avoid the costly court proceedings. If they agree that what they're going to do, we write that down, and then we don't go through a court, but we do follow up. And then there's ultimately the court proceedings, and the fines under CEPA are quite severe. They can go up to $1 million a day for the time that a violation exists. The funding, the fines that we collect, Mr. Wright is suggesting that those be shared with if there's a civil prosecution. If so far to date, it's been the Crown, the federal government doing the prosecution. And the fines, we're encouraging judges to assign those fines to something called the Environmental Damages Fund. That means industry pays into that fund, and we can use the money to rehabilitate the environment, to do community engagement programs, to do something related to the violation to ensure the environment is improved.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The member's question was directed at both departments, and it does provide me an opportunity to explain my silence today, and that is that with respect to enforcement and compliance, the Act is fairly clear that it's environment that does that on behalf of both departments. So we express our concerns, areas, and they act on our behalf. One other piece of information that I think is relevant to this discussion is at a trend level, determining compliance can be done through things like NPRI, where we can see our levels going up or down. On the human health side, we still have a bit of a gap there, in that we don't have programs like biomonitoring that say what are in humans, so that at an aggregate level we can keep track of that, and we're hopeful that at some point in time in the future that will change. Thank you.
Mr. McGinty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I go back to this discussion of the spectrum of possibilities here under SEPA? At one end, pure voluntarism. At the other end, command and control regulation. I think if you stopped any Canadian coming off any bus in any city in Canada, they would understand that it isn't as simple as two extremes. They understand that when they purchase a vehicle that's a hybrid vehicle or an alternative fuel vehicle in Ontario, for example, they'll get a $1,000 provincial sales tax rebate. They'll understand that if they live in Ontario, again, my home province, they must have their vehicles tested on a mandatory basis for emissions testing on a certain number of year basis. And if a car isn't meeting the emissions test, it's got to go back for retrofit. So I think most Canadians understand that SEPA should not and is not simply a conglomeration of two extremes, regulation and command and control versus pure voluntarism. And everybody understands in 40 years of environmental practice in the Western world that there's a full spectrum of possibilities. And I think that's what our smart regulation panel tried to achieve in the past government, which is to say, let's be intelligent about this, let's be cost-effective about this, and let's work hand in glove like a mature democracy, business, and government together. I guess the question I want to put to you again is, I've heard no one here at this panel speak about 2 or 3 other weapons in our arsenal of weaponry in between these two extremes. One is the use of fiscal instruments. And a more specific question to Ms. Wright, if you could hold it in abeyance for a second. How many people inside Environment Canada today are actually working on environment and economy linkages and measures which can help us achieve, for example, SEPA objectives? I would guess that there are less than 10 full-time employees working in Environment Canada in that area. Mr. Lloyd, you mentioned the notion of accelerated capital cost allowance. The Finance Department doesn't like to toy with capital cost allowance. It's been reluctant to do so for 20 years. How many people at Finance Canada are busy delivering options up for consideration by the Canadian people to achieve environmental objectives using economic measures? And finally, I think the most important example that we've seen of using an economic instrument has been the Kyoto Protocol, which was like that old Sesame Street riddle, one of these things is just not like the others. The Kyoto Protocol, for the first time in human history, was going to reflect two things. First, that we have one atmosphere. And two, that we're going to monetize carbon by internalizing the price of carbon in economic decision-making. I would dare say the salt industry would be weighing its approach to salt differently if cumulative environmental impacts were costed. If a dollar figure were placed on damage to a river or damage to a lake using monetary terms, which it could actually feel and go back to its shareholders and account for, it might be different. So I want to put again, Mr. Chairman, if I could, to the panel, two things: measurement and money. No government can actually tell one company over another company, whether it's part of Responsible Care or the Forest Products Association of Canada's pulp and paper standards, or any other industrial conglomeration. No government can say, Company X, you're going to be rewarded this way, Company Y, you will not be rewarded this way, unless they can actually measure it. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. So again, I want to go back. No one's talked about eco-efficiency indicators. How are you actually going to measure apples and apples and apples and oranges? And secondly, How can we use the economic system, fiscal and tax spending, for example, to achieve environmental impacts?
Panel, you only have 1 minute to answer that question.
Well, let me take a crack at that. I mean, I fully agree that the spectrum is what needs to be looked at, and it's not this, shouldn't be this false dichotomy between strict regulation and voluntary. There are things in the middle, and I talked about using pollution prevention planning, which is something in the middle that I think needs to be used a lot more of and isn't being used enough. I agree, finance doesn't seem to be too interested in capital cost allowance, but it does not approach it from an environmental perspective. I think this committee has a real opportunity to say that, yes, this is one of the fiscal instruments that finance should be looking at. I think they would listen to you. And I think that is an important tool that we need to start making use of. And I really hope that is one of the recommendations that this committee will look at in its SEPA review report. Environment will say, well, that's not us, it's finance, but the message would be directed from you to finance.
Culkins.
My first question is fairly straightforward. We're going to deal with enforcement again here. It seems to be where I like to go. The penalties set out in this Act include a fine of up to $1 million and 3 years imprisonment if convicted by indictment, $300,000 and 6 months for summary conviction. What is the maximum fine and prison term ever handed out for a conviction under SEPA 1999?
I can't tell you off the top of my head what the maximum, but I do know it's been going up over the last few years.
So can you give me an average then, or can you give me roughly what we're looking at? I know everything is based on its own merits and levels of severity, but are we close to the top? Are we close to the bottom?
I'd say we're in the mid-zone, but we can get you that information. We can give you this precise.
The clerk would.
Yeah, I'd sure like to know that. And I guess I'm just going to go we'll start with Mr. Hanneman, we'll just go across the panel here. And based on those numbers, based on what we've seen here, $1 million in 3 years or $300,000 in 6 months, depending on whether it's indictment or summary conviction, do these penalties act as sufficient deterrents?
Well, my feeling is that the salt industry is not the object of enforcement with regard to road salts. It's whether you want to fine the City of Toronto or the City of Montreal or the province of whatever, and whether or not there's the political will to impose that kind of a fine on a sister jurisdiction for a violation when the impact is distinctly local. It gets back to the fiscal instrument. You can't very well give tax incentives to a tax-supported organization.
Fair enough. I guess the pushback on you would be, the municipality would say, well, you sold it to us and so on, and there's those repercussions, but ultimately they're responsible for how they apply it. I sat at municipal council, as did Mr. Silva, and several others of us around this table, and had to wrestle with those decisions. I know in Alberta, we use a less than 5% blend of salt with sand and apply it to our roads. And when I come down here, I take there's big chunks of salt laying out on the road, and I've never seen anything like that before in my life until I came down to Ottawa. So
it's a different climate here.
It's completely different situations. Absolutely.
There's no question. But the other point is, it's not the salt that's delivered that causes any problem whatsoever. It's the salt as applied in a particular place at a particular time, given certain local environmental conditions, and that the salt industry cannot control unless it has somebody in the cab of every vehicle that's out there.
But this is the hammer that we're holding over the people who are your clients.
Correct.
So are you worried about that at all?
We are, and that's why for 40 years we've been trying to train them. That's why in the early days of the SEPA assessment, we worked very closely with TAC, Transportation Association of Canada, to develop guidelines which were in fact the running head start that the department was able to work into its code of practice. So I think that both the industry and the customers have been very proactive in trying to reduce the environmental insult of mismanagement of road salt.
I'd sure like to hear from Mr. Stack and Mr. Wright on this as well.
If I could, if you look at our chart, there was only one conviction in 2005. So even if these were at the top end, we're not talking a lot of money. But the fact is, these fines are generally at the lower end of the scale. And certainly in Fisheries Act, the maximum you get up to is around $100,000, $120,000. They're generally $10,000, $20,000. So they're at the low end of the scale. And I would suggest, and that's part of the reason why I'm trying to say let's be equitable in what we use as our enforcement measures. I don't think they're getting down to the tough ones and dealing with them tough enough for those who are lagging behind. Derek, do you have anything?
I don't think either the fine. Thanks, Rob. I don't think either the fines or the threat of regulation have been sufficient to drive even voluntary action.
Mr. Lloyd?
Yeah, I think this question for our membership is almost irrelevant. I mean, this is not what drives our performance. Responsible care is about going beyond regulations, the charts that I've shown you, and the performance we've achieved. We're much more interested in what our communities want us to do, and so we have mechanisms for that. We have mechanisms like this MOU that I was talking about to listen to what stakeholders, and we see government sitting on there as stakeholders, have to say about our performance and where it needs to be improved. And then we go and do it. Our members don't want to get caught up in paper trail violations, but we don't get complaints from that. So I assume that's working properly. But that's not what motivates our members.
Thank you, Mr. Calkins. Mr. Silva.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McGuinty spoke of the spectrum and the tools that are available there within the SEPA. And I guess within those tools and those options, I sort of need to know as well, one of them that we do have, of course, is the ability to fine, and even if it's a gross violation, also imprisonment. And that spectrum goes from $1 million 3 years till, to $300,000 or 6 months imprisonment. But I need to know, what is the maximum ever handed out by the department? Is there anything that's ever...
I can't recall off the top of my head what the maximum is. I'd have to come back to you on that.
How many fines have been laid as well? Do you know the number?
No, but a lot more than one per year. So, again, I couldn't give you that. I'd have to give.
Well, I think that's very valuable information, because we need to know whether, in fact, this is actually the system we have in place is effective, and if it's also being effectively applied as a tool. So, I think that information is quite valuable for the committee. So, I'd appreciate if you can provide that as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to draw your attention to is the number of inspections per year that are up around 5,000. And then how that tracks into some of the tools that I mentioned, like warning letters, 1,000, the environmental protection compliance orders, 100. What it's showing you is that, generally speaking, industry is complying. Out of the 5,000 inspections, an inspection is going on site, finding out if there's a problem, translated into 43 investigations. So that's when somebody goes on site to inspect and starts to find a problem and then launches an investigation. So out of over 5,000 facilities investigated, only 43 translated into an investigation.
When we go out and investigate, for example, and we find that there's a problem, what do? Do we actually just send a warning and then we go back and see if there's another violation and send another warning? I mean, when do we stop? I mean, at what point do we say, like, we have to find these companies and these individuals so that we can, in fact, have a clean environment and one that is sustainable as well?
Well, we have a policy that describes how we go from one step to another, and generally speaking, depending on the nature of the violation, if it's a serious violation, we go from one step to another very quickly.
Okay. Now, you work obviously with the provincial counterparts as well to deal with those. And do they also they're finding a mechanism as well? Does it work well with the ones that we have at the federal level, or is it totally different and apart from what we're doing right now within SEPA?
Well, generally speaking, the two levels of government are actually having quite different regulations, but SEPA does allow us to cooperate with the regulations identical. SEPA allows us to let the federal regulations stand down and the provincial one apply. We also can have work-sharing arrangements with provinces so that we don't send two levels of government in to inspect. Provinces can inspect for us. And then in terms of fines, it's variable, but most of the provinces have tended to follow the federal government level of fines and modernize their regulations, their fines. Probably they don't tend to have the same range of tools that we do in terms of the stop work order type thing and the alternative measures, but I suspect some of them will start copying those.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Mr. Wright, can I go back to some comments you made about public participation? I think also our guest from the SALT Institute mentioned it as well. There are a number of examples of public participation out there. The NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreements Commission for Environmental Cooperation, has a citizen-initiated process. Our Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development has a citizen-initiated process. There are myriad examples in provinces and across American states, and I think even the federal government of the United States, if I recall. Last time I looked at most of them, overall citizen-initiated processes of these kinds were very low. Not for lack of information or for lack of ease or even in some cases intervener funding to make it available for them to initiate an action or initiate a complaint. Why is that?
On the processes you've talked about, the CEC, at the end of the day, all the CEC could do is make a recommendation. They can't make a legally enforceable decision. In the U.S., and of course it's across Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., in the U.S. they have these citizen suit acts that I've been talking about, which we suggest we should have the equivalent under CEPA as we have under the Fisheries Act. So I would suggest in the U.S. they're not using those mechanisms as well, because they have citizen suit provisions, the very kind we're suggesting would work under CEPA. And we think you would see more participation. You sure see it under the Fisheries Act as far as it can go, and I would suggest there's no reason why it wouldn't work here.
What about the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development, Mjirina? She appeared before this committee numerous times in the last couple of years to say that she's disappointed with the uptake of Canadian citizens' participation in a citizen-initiated complaints process, which leads her to formally investigate, for example.
In fact, we're generally the largest customer for the CEC complaint process in Canada. We often use the federal process as well, and it is very useful. It certainly highlights and they investigate well and they deliver a report, and that is used, but we generally would use that as another step to go once beyond, because again, that's a recommendation process. Quite an effective one as it happens in the federal case, but it doesn't go the same length as a private prosecution would, for instance, which would bring the force of law on a specific topic.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGinney. I'd like to thank the panel for being here. Certainly very informative. Thank the members. And just to advise the members that tomorrow the Minister has advised us she will not be attending at 9. We'll start right at 9. We have a set of witnesses. We have a couple of other issues to deal with and motions. And so if we could start right at 9, please. Thank you.